Senator Lummis, thank you so much for being at the Georgetown Passaro Center for Financial Markets and Policy today. I know you have a very important vote coming up, so we will try to make sure to let you get out on time. Senator Lummis was sworn into the United States Senate on January 3rd, 2021, and she became the first woman to serve as the United States Senator from Wyoming. She was first elected to the House in 2008, and prior to serving in the House, Senator Lummis, you spent 8 years as Wyoming State Treasurer and 14 years as a member of the Wyoming State House and Senate. You founded the Financial Innovations Caucus, and Senator Lummis, you serve on the Senate Commerce Committee, on the Banking Committee, on Environment and Public Works. So, but thank you for all your public service. I want to start with, how did you get interested in crypto?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is my first visit to Georgetown, and it's a beautiful campus. I have a daughter and a son-in-law who were interested in digital assets, Bitcoin specifically. And they started explaining to me about decentralized finance, and eventually I got the bug, and they helped me buy my first Bitcoin for $330 per Bitcoin, wow, which is a nice buy. But this was like 2013, 2014, so these were very young assets at the time. And I had served 8 years in the House. They coincided with the Obama presidency. I chose not to run after 2016. And so I was invited to speak at the Satoshi Roundtable, and not about Bitcoin, because I didn't know enough about it, but about how Congress works. And so I went to their session, and I, as they say, went down the rabbit hole and got orange pilled and learned a lot about Bitcoin. And it was an interesting year to be at the Satoshi Roundtable because there at that time were some of the first forks in Bitcoin. There were discussions about whether or not the 21 million that will definitely be issued will happen on the time schedule that was designed by the white paper that Satoshi Nakamoto wrote, or whether it would be expedited. And so there was all kinds of debate among people who were the core developers and the miners and the investors. So I got exposure on a year when the debate was very critical. They had this event on a beach town, and I never went outside the room, and there were no windows in the room. And I was there for 2 days just listening to all these debates. And so that's how I developed my interest, and it grew from there.
Well, you're a great investor. You know what the emerging investment opportunities are. And how has Wyoming become such an innovator?
Mm-hmm. Well, Wyoming became the state legislature that drafted the first set of legislation to include digital assets into their state regulatory authority, recognizing them, creating through their state banking division a set of bank regulation manuals for the special purpose depository institution legislation that Wyoming enacted, which was the first in the nation. And that bank examination manual had been vetted by U.S. Treasury and other federal agencies to make sure it complied with Know Your Customer, the Bank Secrecy Act, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, and a lot of federal regulations that are and laws that are designed to protect consumers with regard to traditional financial assets. So we were the first of our kind and have continued to try to advance legislation and regulatory authority to integrate decentralized financial assets into our state assets, both as stores of value and now more so as means of exchange.
So So, Senator, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about the regulatory issues around digital assets.
Yeah.
So at least the market participants who come to our events, they express frustration with that, while certainly some of our regulators feel like, oh yeah, there's plenty of certainty. There's no uncertainty. You just need to come register with us. And so I want to ask you, do you think there is uncertainty?
There's definitely uncertainty. Yeah. You know, if you talk to people from companies like Coinbase, they will tell you that they've gone to the SEC. They've said, help us understand how we can comply on a regulatory basis. We want to comply. And they didn't hear back from the SEC and subsequently were slapped with enforcement actions. Regulation by enforcement action is not the way to go. So, you know, when I came to the US Senate and realized how little was known about digital assets and that there was no regulatory framework in law, I drafted legislation, then teamed up with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. She had been a securities lawyer in private practice before she was in the Senate, and New York is a state that also has had some advanced work on digital assets. So we teamed up. We have the Lummis-Gillibrand Responsible Financial Innovation Act, which is a comprehensive framework for integrating digital assets into the US economy. And there are parts of it that are starting to move, but the most important regulatory part has not moved yet. We've had some setbacks. A year ago, we had FTX and other failures that made senators really uneasy about moving into this space. Unfortunately, instead of saying, these assets need a regulatory framework, they said, wow, we don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. They were conflating the asset itself, the digital assets, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, with the fraudulent organization structures and people that were using them. You know, you can commit fraud with art, fiat currency, yachts, anything, basically. But unfortunately, when the fraud was committed with cryptocurrencies, people were saying, let's ban cryptocurrencies. So fast forward, Senator Gillibrand and I have been working for the last year to try to explain that there are companies like Chainalysis who do a lot of forensic detective work in the digital asset space, and that they've testified before our committee that it's easier to solve crimes that are committed with cryptocurrencies than with fiat currency. But it's just so hard for people to grasp. And the attention span, I hate to say this, the attention span to try to understand this asset just takes too much time for most people. And so it set us back when FTX and some of its other consequences occurred. Now, our problem, as we were getting closer, is that companies like Binance and Tether, their platforms were being used to send cryptocurrency to Hamas. And so now there's a big concern about its use in illicit finance, that the use case for cryptocurrency is only for illicit finance. So we're trying to get news is. Senator Gillibrand and I sort of retuned our bill after the FTX debacle to provide more consumer protections. And we did work with two real cryptocurrency skeptics in the Senate, Senator Marshall of Kansas and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, to sponsor legislation that was incorporated into the National Defense Authorization Act that the Senate passed on illicit finance specifically. So that passed the Senate. Now, either today or possibly tomorrow, maybe as late as after Thanksgiving, will hopefully pass a motion to instruct the Senate conferees on the National Defense Authorization Act to include the illicit finance language in what is ultimately negotiated between the House and the Senate and becomes law on the NDAA with regard to illicit finance. So pieces of the Lummis-Gillibrand bill are starting to move. Another piece that's starting to move is the piece on stablecoins. And we'd been working, Senator Gillibrand and I had been working with Patrick McHenry, who chairs House Financial Services, and Maxine Waters, who's the ranking Democrat, on the stablecoin piece. And Treasury was involved. So we even had the executive branch on this one. And we were so close. And then, of course, Patrick Henry got distracted to become the pro tem of the House during the whole 3 weeks where they were selecting a new speaker. So that set us back there. But we might be able to get back on track on the stablecoin piece. So as we get some of these pieces of the bill moving, hopefully we can set up the most important part, which is when does the SEC have control? When does the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, have control? Sorry about the acronym soup. And that hopefully will come early next year. Now, one of the reasons I'm optimistic that it might is because we understand that some of the financial service providers in traditional finance may be applying early next year with the SEC to conduct a Bitcoin exchange-traded fund. We're talking companies like Fidelity and BlackRock. So you're talking about reputable traditional financial institutions getting into this space. And
do you think that's something that's going to get approved? I mean, that'll be a huge step, right, moving forward, because there are like 6, 7 asset managers who have filed for a Bitcoin ETF. That'll open up a whole new venue, especially for retail investors.
Absolutely. And so I'm very hopeful that it will, but because it's understood, I think, on Capitol Hill finally, as well as in the regulatory world, that Bitcoin is a commodity, but the approval of an exchange-traded fund would have to go through the SEC, you know, and but the entry of traditional finance into this space, it is a compelling case for the SEC to move forward. It's also a compelling case for Congress to see that traditional finance has accepted Bitcoin as a store of value that has a consumer base that wants to invest in it. So we have to protect those consumers with adequate legislation that's compliant with asset protection laws and international laws. So it's time to move. It's time to move on a regulatory framework. And since Senator Gillibrand and I have continuously updated our bill in response to some of the ideas and concerns that have been raised, we think that our legislation is the correct framework that is the most understood and that should begin to move forward early next year.
So on the AML front, things are moving along. On the stablecoins front, you're pretty optimistic about things moving along.
I am.
But this whole area that you're talking about in terms of what's a security, what's not, how likely is that going to get clarification?
Yeah, well, that I think should be part of moving the package forward about SEC jurisdiction versus CFTC jurisdiction, because you have to know what's a commodity and what's a security. And our bill uses the Howey test, which is pretty well understood. I mean, there are like 130 federal appellate cases that have defined and redefined how the Howey test works. And so it's a well understood, highly documented in case law test to say what's a security and what's a commodity. And then we also create something called an ancillary asset. Right. And the ancillary asset space is something that, you know, involves, if there's an investment contract, You know, it's probably a commodity. Anyway, we create that kind of a category for things that don't fall neatly under the Howey test as a commodity or a security.
So it's interesting you say that after the FTX blew up, the reaction was more about crypto is a bad thing and we should just ban it, rather than we really need regulation in this space and we need clarity, and maybe at least some aspects of FTX might not have happened if we had that clarity and we had proper regulation. Do you see that mindset changing now? It'll take some time? Or?
Well, that took Senator Gillibrand and I by surprise a little bit. So we had to replow old ground that we thought we had already nurtured to the point that it was ready for our legislation. But it set us back a whole year. I'm convinced that that alone was something that caused people to just back away from the table and address things that they understood better. We've got a myriad of things we're trying to juggle and work on all at the same time. So if something requires a deep dive, and this does, because it's a brand new type of asset with all new terminology and the involvement of federal agencies and trying to figure out what the appetite is of the Treasury Department, the SEC, the CFTC, to be involved in this. And then you've got people who think it's only use cases to finance terrorism. There's so much. It requires a deep dive, and so few people have time to take that deep dive. And everybody knows that Senator Gillibrand and I have, so they just go, oh, talk to Lummis and Gillibrand about that, and then end of discussion. And so it's been a challenge to try and address it. So when I first realized that this was a truly misunderstood asset class, Senator Kirsten Sinema from Arizona and I put together something called the Financial Innovation Caucus. And so we have speakers come in and try to educate and inform mostly staffers so they can inform their bosses about how this asset class works, what the issues are, how it can benefit society, what the use cases are that are highly legitimate, what the use cases are that are illegitimate or illegal. And it's been well attended. We had an event today that was extremely well attended by staffers. So we just continue to try to educate and inform and get people trying to look at this piece of legislation.
So, Senator, it's interesting. We at the Passaro Center have also been doing that education. And actually, staff and members of Congress have reached out to us.
Oh,
and
good.
I need my staff. Here is the person who needs to be on top of this. Can the Passaro Center help them? And of course, we are happy to do that, and we have been doing that. So please feel free to reach out to us if we can help in any way here.
Oh, fabulous. I know you can. And I'm so delighted to know you're here. The Passaro Center is a place where people can take deep dives into conversation on financial markets without bias. And
that's the main thing, right? We are completely unbiased, and we try to present all viewpoints. And we are educators, so people can ask us dumb questions, any kind of questions. There's lots of information out there, but I think what we bring to the table as an educational institution is we're not an advocacy group of any kind. So we bring that unbiased aspect. And so we've been doing some of that education. So please lean on us if we can help.
Thank you. And one of my lead staffers is a graduate of Georgetown and has been very helpful in moving this dialogue along in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House and with the executive branch.
So let me ask one other question about this crypto accounting bulletin, 121, and you have concerns about that. Maybe first talk a little bit about what that is and how it impacts banks and other financial institutions and what your concerns are.
Well, this bulletin, it was put out as a bulletin at the SEC to require that you would account for digital assets on your financial institution ledgers as belonging to the company that's holding them, not to the customer. And that to me is completely backwards. The crypto assets are property. The token that sort of embodies the crypto assets discussion is property. And so we're trying to define property as belonging to a customer. So why would you put it on the entity's balance sheet? It seems to me then if you have a bank failure that the asset would be deemed not to belong to the customer. And so I was very pleased when it was determined that this was not a bulletin but rather a rule that failed to go through the Administrative Procedures Act rulemaking, and that it should have and needed to. So I think that's right. I think that this is something that should have been put out for public comment, as is true under the APA for all rules. So we could have had a discussion about whether you treat an asset that is held by a custodian as an asset of the custodian or an asset of the person who actually owns it.
So what is the status now?
Okay, so now we'll go through a process where we use a Congressional Review Act to force this bulletin through a APA process or invalidate it as having been implemented without going through the legal process.
Okay. I want to be very sensitive to your time, but we'll open it up for a few questions. And I'd especially invite our students to ask Senator Lummis questions. Please.
Oh, hi. I'm a freshman in the business school here at Georgetown. And I was wondering, so why do you think support for crypto legislation has been so bipartisan? And if what I've heard is that because of high-profile crises like FTX, that's really highlighted the need for regulation. And if that is the case, if you agree with that, do you think that we need to rely on such crises and other emerging technologies like generative AI to establish such bipartisan consensus in other fields?
Well, I wish we didn't wait until there's a crisis to establish bipartisan consensus and work on these things. It is true that under AI, the discussions that are going on around Capitol Hill, at least on the Senate side, are very bipartisan. Because I don't think artificial intelligence has a partisan hook to hang your coat on. And there are people who want to take a wait-and-see approach to AI, others who want to begin to regulate in a very soft manner, and others who want to regulate in a more heavy-handed manner. So there are like 3 pieces of legislation already floating around Capitol Hill on AI that are a light touch regulation, a medium touch regulation, heavy touch regulation. And the set of players that gravitate towards each is bipartisan. So it's very interesting. I do think because Web3 AI is dealing with the larger issue. So cryptocurrency is sort of a component of Web3. And it is the property component of Web3. And so it also is very bipartisan because we're dealing with decentralized finance. And so where it tends to shake out is not on Democrat-Republican lines, but people who are comfortable with decentralized finance and people who want centralized finance. And that, so you see people who are more libertarian-ish, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, being comfortable with decentralized. For example, Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, who currently is chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, comes from a state that is very liberal/libertarian. I come from a state, Wyoming, that's very conservative/libertarian, but where we meet is in that libertarian side. So Ron Wyden and I sponsor lots of legislation together that involves personal privacy and that involves a greater trust in decentralized finance. Whereas there are other people, you see Roger Marshall from Kansas, a Republican, and Elizabeth Warren, who's very liberal, tend to go together because they're more comfortable with a government-controlled financial system. So it shakes out in really interesting ways on a partisan basis. And I've always found that it's fun to, I like the strange bedfellow stuff because people tend to, if you've got people that you normally wouldn't put together as co-sponsoring something and advocating for something, it's more apt to pique your interest. And you're more apt to think, wow, I'll bet this is kind of balanced because those two don't normally agree on much. So this might be a balanced piece of legislation. So, I think that's working out really well in the Senate right now, where you have a Senate that is almost 50-50, where you see those strange bedfellows get together. It's fun. Makes for a good piece of legislation.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. How about we'll take one more question.
Senator, thank you. My name is Andrew. I'm a graduate student in the Court School of Public Policy here. You mentioned the need to educate policymakers who have a lot of things to work on and a very little amount of time to do it. If I have a new product or a new technology or a new something that's going to require educating policymakers, in your experience, what is the best way to do that? Who do you think does a good job of that? And who do you think does a bad job of that? As many specific examples as you can give me is very helpful.
Wow. It's consumer products, the Commerce Committee. So I think what you need to do is identify who the right audience is. So you're not trying to get widespread, really broad knowledge that is a mile wide and an inch deep. What you really want is just the opposite. It's narrow, but it's deep, because those are going to tend to be your advocates. And as I mentioned earlier, in the US Senate, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you come to a Senate office and start discussing digital assets, whether it's stablecoin or Bitcoin or non-fungible tokens or CDBCs, central bank digital currencies, everybody says, oh, go see Lummis or go see Gillibrand. And it's because everybody knows that we're the ones who've taken the deep dive. And so I would say identify what you're marketing. Let's say it's a consumer product. Pick people on the Commerce Committee that tend to have expertise in consumer products, and go in and meet with them and give them a lot of information, give their staff a lot of information. If you can demonstrate your product with them, even better. Example, the University of Wyoming is working on new uses for coal because coal has fallen into disfavor as a thermal source. So University of Wyoming is making asphalt out of coal. They're making bricks out of coal. And I am just thrilled out of my wits because Wyoming is the largest coal producing state in the nation. And it's something that has value. And maybe as we turn to other uses other than as a thermal source, I'm going to be all ears. So I think the most important thing is identify those people who are most likely to have the same intellectual curiosity that you have and focus on them. Did
Thank
that
you.
answer your question?
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic, Senator Lummis. Last year we had Senator Lummis and Gillibrand on a pre-recorded video talking about your very comprehensive bill that you had introduced. This year we are delighted to welcome you on campus in person.
Thank you.
And we hope to have you here in the future also. So thank you.
Go Hoyas. Thank you. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I know you're so